The alarm went off at 5:15, same as every morning. Ethan Cole reached across the nightstand without opening his eyes, silenced it on the first press, and lay still for exactly 30 seconds. That was his ritual, 30 seconds of quiet before the day demanded everything. He had learned, after 3 years of doing this alone, that the 30 seconds made a difference. Not much, but enough. He dressed in the dark. He had laid out his clothes the night before. Dark slacks. The white Oxford he'd ironed until the creases were sharp as paper edges, and the charcoal blazer that still fit the way it had when he'd bought it 6 years ago, back when he'd been a different person with a different life. He laced his boots slowly, checking the knot twice, a habit carried over from his father, who had told him once that a man's attention to small things revealed his attention to everything. The kitchen light was the only warmth in the apartment. Ethan moved through it with the economy of someone who had memorized every surface. He ground the coffee, listening to the sound of it rough and mechanical and real, while the sky outside the window was still the deep blue-black of earliest morning. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in Millbrook, a neighborhood that had seen better decades but still carried itself with a kind of tired dignity. The heating vents rattled. The pipes groaned on cold mornings. In February, like today, it was always cold. He poured a second mug and set it on the counter. Then he went down the hall. Lily's room was small, made smaller by the things she loved. Books stacked horizontally because the shelves were full, drawings tacked to the wall, without any system beyond what had pleased her in the moment. A collection of small animal figures arranged on the windowsill, according to rules only she understood. She was 7 years old, and already had opinions about organization that Ethan had learned not to question. She was asleep on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, the other wrapped around a worn stuffed rabbit named Douglas. She had named the rabbit herself, at age 3, and had defended the name with such certainty that no one had ever challenged it. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on her shoulder. Lily. Time. She made a sound like a small engine turning over without catching. Lily. 5 more minutes. We talked about this last night. She opened one eye. The eye was brown and skeptical, unmistakably her mother's eye, and it looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was deciding whether to be reasonable. After a moment, she rolled over and sat up, and Douglas slid off the bed and landed face down on the floor with a soft thump. Is it snowing? She asked. Ethan glanced at the window. The glass was faintly gray, the sky behind it colorless. Maybe. She brightened at that. Snow was still magic to her, which he was grateful for. There were so many things he couldn't give her. He held on to the ones he could. She was dressed and eating oatmeal by 6:20. She had a small wheeze when she breathed through her mouth, a mild respiratory thing that the doctor had said was manageable, that they monitored twice a year, that required an inhaler she kept in her backpack and almost never needed. Ethan tracked the word almost the way a navigator tracks wind direction, always without announcing it. He had taken Lily to her last pulmonology appointment in November. Dr. Farrell had been reassuring in the careful, measured way of doctors, who know that reassurance is a form of medicine that must be dosed correctly. She had explained the winter risk cold, dry air, the way inflammation could build imperceptibly before expressing itself, and she had adjusted Lily's protocol slightly and asked them to return in 3 months. 3 months was February. The appointment was next week. The pediatric pulmonology department at Mercy General had a different doctor, a Dr. Claudine Roth, who was apparently the best in the state for pediatric respiratory cases in Lily's category. Her waiting list was 14 weeks. Ethan had called 4 months ago and been told 14 weeks. He had called again 2 months ago and been told 11 weeks, which was progress of a kind that felt like water wearing its stone. He thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, before the day assembled its demands. Not obsessively, he was not an obsessive person, but with the steady attention of someone who has identified a problem and is tracking its resolution without being able to accelerate it. This was, in some ways, his central skill, the ability to hold a long-term concern without allowing it to consume the immediate, to keep going while waiting. His mother had called it stubbornness. His wife, Claire, had called it patience. He suspected it was somewhere between the two, a kind of sustained forward motion that looked like both, depending on what angle you observed it from. He still thought about Claire in the mornings, less than he used to. The shape of the grief had changed, which the therapist he'd seen in the first year had promised him would happen, and which he had not quite believed until it did. It was not smaller, exactly. It was more familiar. The way an old injury becomes familiar present, felt, but no longer in charge of every movement. "You look fancy," Lily said, examining him across the table. "I have that interview today. The important one." Yes, she considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. "Are you nervous?" "A little. Douglas says you'll be fine." She held the rabbit up briefly in evidence, then set it back in her lap. "He's usually right." Ethan looked at her at the oatmeal on her chin, the two slightly uneven braids he had made that morning. The rabbit regarded with such complete trust, and felt the particular weight that he carried every day, the one that was not quite sadness, and not quite fear, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. He had interviewed for this position because of her. The salary was nearly double what he made now. The benefits included health coverage that would give Lily access to the pediatric pulmonologist at Mercy General without the 3-month wait. He needed this job the way a man needs air, quietly, urgently, without theater. "Finish your oatmeal," he said. "We leave in 10 minutes. The snow started at 7:40. It came quietly at first light, provisional, the kind that might stop before it became serious. Ethan drove Lily to Westbrook Elementary through streets that were still mostly clear, the radio low, the heater pushing warm air against the windshield. Lily was telling him about a book she was reading, about a girl who lived on a lighthouse, and he listened the way he always listened to her, with most of his attention, leaving the rest for the road. He dropped her at the school entrance at 8:12. She jumped out, hauled her backpack onto both shoulders, turned back once. "Good luck, Dad." "Thank you. Douglas says." "I know what Douglas says." She grinned wide, sudden, her mother's grin, and ran toward the doors. Ethan pulled back into traffic. By 8:20, the snow had become serious. He took Meridian Avenue, which was the faster route, and the flakes were thick now, swirling in the headlights of oncoming cars, and settling on the road fast enough that the tire tracks ahead of him were already softening at the edges. He checked the clock. He was running ahead of schedule 12 minutes, which was his preferred margin. He had mapped the route 3 times the previous week, had identified alternate paths, had estimated contingencies. He was the kind of man who prepared the way other people breathed, automatically, continuously, without thinking about it as something exceptional. He was passing beneath the Route 9 overpass when he saw the car. It had gone into the guardrail on the far side of the intersection, not violently, or the guardrail wouldn't have held, but with enough force to crumple the driver's side door inward. The car was a gray sedan, tilted at an angle on the ice, and its hazard lights were blinking orange through the snow. Steam was coming from somewhere under the hood. The engine was still running. He could hear it even from here, a grinding, labored sound. He looked at the clock. He looked at the car. No one had stopped. There were other vehicles in both directions, slowing to observe. Their occupants' faces pale blurs behind glass. And then, moving on. He understood this. He understood the calculus. The cold, the inconvenience, the instinctive certainty that someone else would stop, that there were systems for this, that one person's hesitation was not abandonment but only delay. He understood all of it in the 1.5 before he pulled over. He got out of the car. The cold hit him immediately, not just the temperature but the wind off the overpass, which found every seam of his jacket and pressed through. He crossed the road at a jog, and as he got closer he could see the driver through the cracked windshield. A woman, somewhere in her 50s. Her head against the headrest, one hand pressed flat against the window glass. She was conscious. Her mouth was moving. "Ma'am." He knocked on the passenger window, which was intact. "Can you hear me?" She turned her head toward him. Her face was pale and frightened, and there was a cut above her eyebrow that was bleeding in the neat, determined way cuts do when there's real pressure behind them. "I can't." Her voice was muffled through the glass. "The door won't. Don't try to move it. I'm going to call for help first. Can you tell me if you're in pain?" She thought about this with the careful attention of someone conducting an inventory. My shoulder and my knee. Anywhere else? I don't think so. He called 911. The dispatcher was calm and clear, which helped. He gave the location, described the car and the driver. And the dispatcher said units were 12 to 15 minutes away. He stayed on the line and knelt down to look at the driver's side door. The crumple wasn't catastrophic. The door had bent, but not breached the frame, but it had jammed the mechanism. The window was cracked. He could work with that. He put his elbow against the window, found the weakest point near the corner, and applied pressure until the crack widened. It took 3 attempts. On the 4th, the window gave enough that he could clear the remaining glass safely, reach in, and find the manual lock. The door required both hands and all of his weight, and 2 attempts that failed before the 3rd pulled it open. The woman's name was Margaret. She told him this as he helped her out carefully. One hand behind her shoulders, one under her arm, watching the placement of her feet on the ice. She was steadier than he'd expected once she was standing, though she leaned against him with most of her weight. Her coat was dark green. She was shaking, but not from cold. "You stopped," she said. She was looking at him the way people look at something they didn't expect to see. "Yes, nobody else stopped. The ambulance will be here soon. Let's get you away from the car." He walked her to the shoulder, away from the engine's grinding, and stood with her until the sound of sirens reached them from somewhere up Meridian. By the time the paramedics were out of the vehicle and moving toward them, Ethan had already checked the clock twice. He was 22 minutes behind schedule. He said nothing to Margaret about the interview. He answered the paramedics' questions about what he had witnessed and signed a brief statement and declined to give a press contact. Then he walked back to his car, got in, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. 22 minutes. He could call ahead. He could explain. He could tell them what had happened and let the story work for him. The thought moved through his mind and passed without stopping. The way a stranger walks through a room you're sitting in. He was not interested in the story working for him. He was interested in the interview, and the job, and what the job would mean for Lily's lungs in winter. He put the car in drive and went. Caldwell Group occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a building on Commerce Street that was all glass and gray steel, the kind of architecture designed to signal permanence. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk and an elevator bank that took him up without speaking. The conference room was on 14. He found it by following the sound of low voices and the sight of a receptionist who checked his name against a list with an expression that suggested she had expected him earlier and was now adjusting downward her expectations of the day. He pushed open the door at 9:22. There were 7 people at the table. He registered them in the way he registered most things quickly, without commentary, but the details resolved themselves into a clear picture in the first 5 seconds. A row of men in their 40s and 50s. 2 of them already leaning back in their chairs with the comfortable posture of people who had already formed an opinion. A woman in her early 40s at the head of the table, dark hair, dark blazer, the kind of stillness that was not relaxation but control. A younger man to her left with a laptop open, typing something as Ethan entered. On the whiteboard behind the table, someone had written a start time. 9 o'clock. It had not been erased. The woman at the head looked up. Her eyes were gray, and they moved over him the way a sensor moves over a surface, registering, categorizing, completing the assessment before he had taken a 3rd step into the room. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Hale." He had researched the panel. Victoria Hale, CEO, 4 years in the role. Before that, a decade in operations. Before that, an engineering degree from a university that placed rigor above reputation. A person who valued precision. He had thought that was in his favor. "You're 22 minutes late." "I know. I apologize." One of the men to her left brought her shoulders, a ring on his right hand. The air of someone accustomed to being the most impatient person in any room made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close enough. "Traffic?" he said. "No," Ethan said. He sat down in the open chair. He placed his folder on the table. He met Victoria Hale's eyes and held them for a moment. And she looked back with an expression that gave away nothing. "We'll proceed," she said. The questions were what he had prepared for, technical, layered, designed to separate competence from fluency. They asked about load-bearing systems and preventive maintenance cycles and failure diagnostics on integrated HVAC arrays. He answered each one precisely, in the fewest words that conveyed the complete answer, which was the only way he knew how to talk about work. He understood well, but the room had already made up its mind. He could feel it not in anything said overtly, but in the way attention distributes itself differently when it has already reached a conclusion. The laptop man had stopped typing. The broader man to Hale's left kept checking something on his phone, just barely enough to be impolite. A woman across the table, who had introduced herself as Director of Operations, was professional and engaged, but her engagement had the quality of someone going through a process rather than participating in one. There was a moment, partway through, when he came closest to explaining himself. Sandra Okafor, Director of Operations, had asked him about the longest project he had managed without direct oversight. He had described the retrofit work at the Parkview Industrial Complex 3 years ago, which had involved coordinating 4 subcontractors across a 9-month timeline with no site supervisor after the original hire had left mid-project. He had given the timeline, the budget variance 4% under, and the outcome. While he was speaking, he noticed that 2 people at the table had shifted slightly forward in their chairs, but the undercurrent of the room did not change. The tilted perception had been set at the moment he walked in, and the technical answers, however accurate, were flowing past it rather than through it. He had seen this dynamic before, in smaller rooms with smaller stakes. The way a first impression, once installed, filters everything that follows. Evidence is interpreted rather than received. Competence is evaluated through the lens of the initial judgment rather than on its own terms. He was not angry about it. He recognized it as a structural problem, not a personal one. The people in this room were not cruel, they were operating on incomplete information. Which was what people did. It was not, he thought, entirely different from what he did every time he assessed a mechanical system without a full diagnostic readout. You worked with what you had, you made your best inference, and sometimes you were wrong. The difference was that in his work, when you were wrong, you went back and looked again. The man on Hale's left, his name was Gregory Marsh, Director of Facilities, set his phone down and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man preparing to make a point. Mr. Cole, this is a senior position. The expectation is that the person in this role models the values of the department. He paused. Punctuality is one of them. I understand, Ethan said, and yet, the silence invited him to fill it. He did not. Marsh spread his hands slightly. You don't feel the need to explain? I explained when I arrived. I apologized for the delay. You said you were sorry. You didn't explain. No. Another pause. Marsh glanced at Hale. Hale was looking at Ethan with the same calibrated expression she had worn since he walked in, but something in it had shifted slightly, an adjustment so small it might have been his imagination. Why not? She asked. He considered the question. Not long he had already thought about this in the car, in the elevator, in the 30 seconds of stillness before he'd pushed open the conference room door, because the explanation would sound like an excuse, he said. And I didn't come here to make excuses. Marsh said, that's a convenient philosophy for someone who was 22 minutes late. Ethan looked at him. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. The interview continued for another 35 minutes. At the end, Victoria Hale gathered her notes and looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was final. We have other candidates to consider, she said. We'll be in touch. He knew, listening to the precision of her phrasing, that they would not. He thanked them for their time. He shook hands with each person at the table firmly, briefly, looking each one in the eye. He picked up his folder. He left. In the elevator, alone, he stood with his back against the rear wall and watched the floor numbers descend. He thought about Lily. He thought about the pediatric pulmonologist at Mercy General, about the 3-month wait, about the winter that had 6 more weeks in it, and the way her breathing changed when the air was cold and dry. He thought about the apartment and the rattling vents and the second mug of coffee he set out every morning. And then he stopped thinking about all of it, the way you have to stop touching a wound to let it close. He thought, briefly, about the woman. Margaret. He hoped she was all right. He hoped the ambulance had been warm. The lobby marble was cold underfoot even through his boots. He passed the security desk, and the guard gave him the reflexive nod of a person who nods at everyone regardless of context. And he nodded back. Outside, the snow had slowed to something intermittent and exhausted. The sky was the dull, even white of a day that has done what it set out to do. He walked to his car with his collar up. He sat in it for a moment, without starting the engine, not in despair, which was not his register, but in the plain acknowledgement of the situation. He had prepared carefully. He had answered correctly. He had done everything within his control. The thing outside his control had happened. And now the outcome was what it was. He would call the school to check on Lily's pickup arrangements. He would go back to Meridian Works tomorrow. He would call the Mercy General waitlist again next month. Or sooner, if anything changed. He put the car in drive and drove home through streets where the snow was already turning gray at the edges. The meeting that followed the interviews was supposed to be a debrief. Victoria Hales sat at the head of the same conference table and listened to Gregory Marsh explain why the other candidates were stronger prospects, and she took notes in the margin of her legal pad with a pen she had owned for 11 years, which was the kind of detail about herself she had never shared with anyone and did not intend to. She was thinking about something she couldn't quite name, a quality in the way Ethan Cole had answered the question about the explanation, not the answer itself, the texture of the pause before it. She had learned, over 22 years in various configurations of leadership, to pay attention to pauses. Her assistant, a young man named Preston, knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which he only did when the news was time-sensitive. "There's something on the building feed you should see," Preston said. He had his laptop open. On the screen was a playback of the traffic camera footage at the Route 9 overpass on Meridian Avenue. Time-stamped that morning at 8:47. The quality was grainy, the angles imperfect, but the sequence of events was legible. A gray sedan in the guardrail. Other vehicles slowing and continuing. One car dark blue, the license plate visible in the freeze frame Preston had pulled up, pulling over. A figure in a charcoal blazer crossing the road. The room was very quiet. "That's him," said the director of operations. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she said it not as a question. "Yes," Preston said. "The news report came through about 20 minutes ago. The woman who was in the accident, Margaret Hollis, she was transferred to Street Clements, non-critical. She's speaking to media now." He pulled up the second window. A hospital corridor. A woman sitting up in a bed with a bandage above her eyebrow, talking to someone off camera. She's describing the man who helped her. Victoria listened to the description. Dark blazer. Quiet. Didn't say much. Refused to give his name to the paramedics for the press. Got back in his car and left. She said he seemed like he was in a hurry, Preston said. She said she felt bad about that. Victoria set her pen down. She looked at the footage still paused on Preston's screen, the dark blue car pulled to the shoulder. The figure in the blazer at the crumpled driver's side door of the sedan, snow coming down in the background like something staged. She thought about 22 minutes. She thought about the explanation would sound like an excuse. Then she thought about something else, something she hadn't thought to look for until now, and she said, "Pull up his full file." His employment history was clean in the way that history is only clean when someone has been careful for a very long time. 8 years at Pinnacle Infrastructure Services. Rising from technician to senior lead. A record of performance evaluations that used words like exceptional and indispensable, and, in one instance, the clearest operational thinker this department has seen in a decade. Then a gap. 11 months. Then a series of contract positions, progressively shorter, at smaller firms. Then his current position at a facilities maintenance company called Meridian Works, which was not small, but was not what his record suggested he should be doing. She read it twice. On the second pass, she paid attention to a different set of things, not the progression of roles but the specific language used to describe his work. Rebuilt the preventive maintenance protocol from first principles. That was from a performance review dated 6 years ago. Identified a cascade failure point in the central cooling array that the original engineering team had classified as non-critical. That was a commendation note, not even a formal evaluation. Someone had written it in the margin of a quarterly report. She had seen systems like that at Pinnacle informal documentation, meaning the note had been important enough to make, but not important enough to route through official channels. Someone had valued him enough to write it down but had not, apparently, valued him enough to keep him when circumstances changed. Sandra Okafor, reading over Victoria's shoulder, said quietly, "What happened in the gap?" Preston, who had gone a level deeper into the background documentation, said, "His wife passed away. April. 3 years ago." He paused. "He has a daughter. 7 years old." The room was quiet again. Victoria had been in 43 hiring panels over the course of her career. She had been the deciding voice in all of them. She had gotten it wrong before she knew this, held it privately, the way you hold most real knowledge about yourself. But she could count on one hand the times she had felt the wrongness in the moment, had felt the decision calcifying before all the information was in, had felt the panel close itself around a narrative before the subject had finished speaking. She thought about the pause before his answer. The explanation would sound like an excuse. She had registered it in the moment as evasion. She now understood it differently. It was the statement of a man who had learned, at some cost, the difference between justification and truth. A man who had decided, before walking into the room, that he would rather lose the job honestly than keep himself in contention through a story, however true the story was. She had spent 22 years building rooms designed to separate people by their qualities. She wondered, sitting with his file open in front of her, how many times those rooms had confused silence with weakness. She picked up her pen. Gregory Marsh, who had been quiet since Preston came in, said, "We made a judgment call. We didn't have context." "No," Victoria said. "We made a judgment." She drew a single line through the notation she had made during the interview. The notation read, "Punctuality, professionalism, character." She drew the line slowly, pressing down slightly. "The way you close a door, you should have left open." Then she said, "Find out where he is." Preston took 4 hours to locate him, which said something about how thoroughly Ethan Cole existed in no digital space he hadn't personally constructed. There was no professional profile, no photograph, no record of his address beyond what the application had required. He left the smallest possible footprint, which might have looked like privacy, or might have looked like someone who had learned, at some point, that the world's attention was not something to cultivate. During those 4 hours, Victoria did not sit still. She walked the length of the 15th floor twice, which was not something she normally did. She was a desk person, a sitter, someone who believed that stillness was its own form of productivity. She stood at the window of her office and looked at the city and thought about what Preston had told her. His wife passed away. April. 3 years ago. He has a daughter. 7 years old. She had a habit, formed over years of hiring decisions, of building a mental picture of the people she interviewed. Not physical, she was careful about that, had trained herself away from it, but architectural. The structure of a person's decisions, the pattern of what they moved toward and what they held firm against. She had built a picture of Ethan Cole in the conference room this morning, and the picture had been a small, flat thing, late, evasive, unlikely. Now she was rebuilding it from different material, and it was coming out larger and more complicated than she had room for, which was uncomfortable. She thought about the second mug. It was an invented detail. She hadn't seen it, didn't know if it existed, but it was the kind of detail that felt true, and she had learned over the years to trust the details that felt true, which was perhaps the same skill that he had been using when he stopped his car on Meridian Avenue. The recognition of something that couldn't be walked past. The address was in Millbrook. Victoria drove herself. This was not unusual. She drove herself frequently, because she found that being driven made her passive in a way she disliked, but the nature of the drive was unusual. She took the Commerce Street Bridge and went north, away from the district, through neighborhoods that changed in register as the glass and steel gave way to brick, to wood, to the specific texture of places where people managed rather than chose. She passed a school on the way, not Westbrook, a different one, but similar in the way that schools built in the same decade are similar. Low-slung, brick, a chain-link fence with a sagging section near the gate. She thought about a 7-year-old with a rabbit named Douglas and an inhaler in her backpack. She thought about the gap year in Ethan Cole's employment record. 11 months, long enough to grieve and reassemble. Long enough to make smaller compromises in order to keep moving. Long enough, she understood now, to have developed the particular quiet of someone who has stopped expecting the world to offer him things he hasn't first demonstrated he deserves. She had never been a parent. She had come close once, and then circumstances had arranged themselves otherwise, and she had redirected the same energy into the life she had instead. She did not regret this. But she understood, sitting in traffic 2 blocks from his building, that there were forms of accountability she had no framework for. The accountability of the morning alarm, the accountability of the 5:15 wake-up, the ironed shirt, the 2 braids made with imperfect evenness in a small bathroom mirror. The accountability of an interview you need for reasons that have nothing to do with ambition. She parked in front of a building with 4 buzzers and a wreath on the door that was probably left over from December. She had been in buildings like this. Not recently. She buzzed apartment 3B. A child's voice came through the intercom. "Who is it?" Victoria said. "My name is Victoria Hale. I'm looking for Mr. Cole." A pause. Then, "One moment, please." The politeness of a child who had been taught politeness, which was not the same as the politeness of a child who had been told to perform it. A minute passed. Then the door clicked open. He was at the kitchen table when she reached the 3rd floor, and the apartment door was open. Lily had opened it and was standing in the frame looking at Victoria with the frank assessment of a child who has learned not to be afraid of strangers, but has also learned to look carefully before deciding what to feel about them. She was small for 7. With her father's stillness and a pair of eyes that Victoria would describe afterward. To no one, because she had no one in particular to describe things to, as the kind of eyes that remember things. "You can come in," Lily said. "He's in the kitchen." The apartment was small. Victoria registered this, not with pity. She was careful about pity, found it a form of condescension, but with the specific attention she gave to environments, which she had learned told you more about people than most things they said. The space was ordered without being sterile. Books everywhere, organized by what appeared to be subject rather than size. A child's drawings on the refrigerator, held by magnets, shaped like vegetables. A disassembled toy on the kitchen table. Some kind of motorized vehicle, its chassis open, its components laid out in a neat row. Ethan was sitting in front of it with a small screwdriver. He had changed out of the blazer. He was in a gray Henley and looked, in this context, like a completely different person from the one who had sat across the conference table from her 8 hours ago. Less formal but not smaller. If anything, the opposite. He looked up when she came into the kitchen. His expression went through something surprise, and then a kind of careful settling before it arrived at neutral. "Miss Hale, Mr. Cole." She gestured at the toy. "I'm sorry to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." He set the screwdriver down. "Lily, can you go read for a few minutes?" Lily picked up Douglas from the chair beside her. She looked at Victoria one more time, still assessing, and then she went down the hall with the deliberate dignity of someone who has agreed to leave, but wants it on record that she is choosing to do so. Victoria pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This was unusual. She was rarely in rooms where she was not the one who controlled the silence. She found she didn't mind it. "I saw the footage," she said. "From the camera on Meridian. The accident this morning." He was quiet. "The woman's name is Margaret Hollis," Victoria said. "She's a senior partner at Hollis & Crane. They've been a consulting partner of ours for 6 years. She paused. "That's not why I'm here. I want to be clear about that." "All right. I'm here because I made a decision this morning on insufficient information. And I've spent my career trying to be the kind of person who corrects that when she recognizes it." He looked at her. His expression had not changed substantially. It was still the same careful, watchful stillness she had observed in the conference room, but something in it had opened slightly, the way a window opens when you press the latch without knowing it. "I should have explained," he said finally. "That's on me. You said the explanation would sound like an excuse." "It would have, maybe." She folded her hands on the table. Or maybe there's a version of it that sounds like someone telling the truth. He considered this. Down the hall, she could hear Lily reading aloud softly to Douglas, a murmured, rhythmic sound that was the most private thing she had heard in a long time. A woman was trapped, Ethan said. I stopped. By the time the ambulance came, I was too late to make it on time. He said it the way he'd answered the technical questions in the interview precisely, without ornamentation, in exactly as many words as the fact required. I didn't mention it because I didn't want the job because of it. Victoria looked at him. I wanted the job because I can do the job, he said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you can. I know. There it was. Not arrogance, she had a calibrated ear for arrogance. Could identify it at great distance, but something quieter and more absolute. The particular confidence of someone who knows their own value without needing anyone else to confirm it. She felt, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a disassembled toy between them and the sound of his daughter's voice coming down the hall. The specific weight of having been wrong. It was not a comfortable feeling. She did not try to make it comfortable. I owe you an apology, she said. You made the decision you had reason to make. That's not the same as making the right one. He held her gaze. She noticed that he did not look away, but he also did not lean in, did not try to extract anything from the moment. He received the apology the way he seemed to receive most things, steadily, without theater. I appreciate you saying it, he said. She made the offer carefully. She had thought about this on the drive over, not rehearsed it exactly, but thought about the shape of it. She had learned that the way you offer something tells the person as much as the thing itself. The position is yours if you want it, she said. Not the one you interviewed for. The one above it, Senior Director of Technical Operations. He was very still. The salary is different. The scope is larger. She named the number. He didn't react to it, which told her he had done the research and knew what the range was. There's a full benefits package, dependent health coverage. She watched him not react to that, either. But something shifted in his stillness, a change so small it was barely perceptible. Like a slight adjustment in barometric pressure before weather. I have a daughter, he said. I know. She has a respiratory condition. Mild, but I know, Mr. Cole. She said it gently. The coverage includes specialist access. Mercy General's Pediatric Pulmonology Department is in the network. Silence. I'm not offering you this because of this morning, she said. I want to be clear about that. Then why? It wasn't quite a question. She answered it as if it were. Because you have a record that should have put you in a room like ours 3 years ago, and instead you've spent 3 years in positions that were beneath your capability, and when you finally got into the room you answered every technical question correctly, maintained your composure under conditions designed to make you fail, and declined to compromise your own integrity even when it cost you something. She paused. That's the person I want in this role. He looked at the table, at the disassembled toy, at his own hands, which were still. The hours, he said, flexible. We have a core schedule, but I don't manage attendance. I manage outcomes. I'd need to be available for school pickups. Lily has there are appointments. That's not a problem. You're saying that now. She met his eyes. I'm saying it as a term of employment. I'll put it in writing. Another silence, longer than the others. Why would you do that? He said. The question was genuine, not suspicious, not challenging, but genuinely curious. She thought about how to answer it honestly. Because I don't want to lose you again to something I could have controlled, she said. And because, she stopped. Started again. I have spent a long time believing that the way we run rooms like that one this morning is the right way. That it's efficient and fair, and that it finds the right people. She looked at the toy between them. I'm less certain of that than I was 12 hours ago. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, I'll need to think about it. Of course. Tonight. I'll give you an answer in the morning. She nodded. She stood, and she held out her hand. And he shook it the way he had shaken the hands of every person at the conference table, firmly, briefly, without performance. She was almost to the door, When Lily appeared from the hallway, Douglas under one arm, looking at Victoria with the same frank assessment as before, but now with something else added to it. Curiosity, maybe, or the beginning of a decision. "Are you going to give my dad a job?" Lily asked. Victoria looked at the girl. "I offered him one," she said. "It's up to him." Lily considered this seriously. "He's very good at fixing things," she said. "And he's never late. This morning was because of an emergency." "I know," Victoria said. "He told me. Did he tell you about the lady in the car?" "Yes." Lily nodded, satisfied. The way children are satisfied, when adults have been given information that confirms what the child already knew. "Douglas says he'll take the job," she said. Victoria looked at Ethan. He was looking at his daughter, with the expression of a man who has learned to trust the instincts of a 7-year-old with a rabbit. "Tell Douglas thank you," Victoria said. He called at 7:50 the next morning. Victoria was already at her desk. She was always at her desk before 8. A habit she had carried for 15 years without interruption, and she answered on the second ring. "I'll take it," Ethan said. "Good. The terms we discussed. I'll have Preston send the contract this morning. You can have it reviewed by—" "I don't need it reviewed. I trust you to put in what you said." She paused, not because she was surprised, but because she wanted to register it properly. "All right. When do I start?" "Monday, if that works for you." "It does. Mr. Cole." Ethan. She looked out the window at Commerce Street, where the morning was clear and cold, and the snow from yesterday had been pushed into gray ridges along the curb. "Thank you. For what?" She thought about the question. "For not making it easier than it was." A pause on his end. Then, "I appreciate the second look." He hung up. She held the phone for a moment, then set it on the desk, and returned to the report she had been reading. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the morning, assembling itself, rehearsing its certainties, preparing to make all the decisions that would seem, in 12 hours, to have been obvious. She underlined something in the report. She moved on. He arrived on Monday at 8:45, 15 minutes before the formal start of the core schedule. Preston showed him to his office on 15. It was a real office, with a window that faced north, away from the ornamental front of the building, and toward the parts of the city that were used rather than displayed. He stood at the window for a moment before sitting down. He could see, from this angle, the Route 9 overpass on Meridian, or at least the general location of it, suggested by the curve of elevated roadway above the buildings. The snow from Thursday had been pushed to the sides of the road, and was already the gray-brown color of things returning to the ground. He thought about Margaret. He had looked up her name in the news coverage. Preston had been right. She was a senior partner at Hollis and Crane, and he had read far enough to confirm she was recovering well before closing the browser. He had not reached out to her. He did not intend to. What had happened on Meridian Avenue was finished. It belonged to the morning it had occurred, and he did not feel any need to carry it forward into the parts of his life that came after. His desk had been cleared, the surface clean except for a notepad, 2 pens, and a printed copy of the technical documentation he had been asked to review. He sat down, aligned the notepad with the edge of the desk, and read the first page. The documentation was for the Caldwell Group's central facilities integration across 3 buildings, a project that, from what he could read in the first 2 pages, had been stalled for 8 months due to a cascade of contractor disagreements and a diagnostic report that had not resolved the underlying inconsistency it had been commissioned to address. He read carefully. By the second page, he had already identified the inconsistency, which was not complicated. It was the kind of thing that got missed when the people looking at a system were too close to their own investment in its previous design to see the obvious flaw in the new one. He made a note. He turned the page. At 9 o'clock, he heard the conference room fill up at the end of the hall. The voices of the people he would be working with. Gregory Marsh, whose voice he recognized by register. Sandra Okafor. Others he hadn't yet placed. He heard laughter at one point, the relaxed, territorial laughter of people in a familiar environment. He was not part of that familiarity yet. He would be, in time, or he wouldn't. He did not lose focus, thinking about it. At 9 to 10, Victoria Hale knocked once on his open door. "Ready?" she said. "Yes." They walked down the hall together. When he came through the conference room door, The conversation stopped. Not the way conversation stops when something uncomfortable enters a room, but the way it stops when something is being recalibrated. Gregory Marsh looked at him with an expression that had more in it than Ethan had expected to see. Something like acknowledgement. Something that required effort to show. Marsh gave him a brief nod. Ethan returned it. Sandra Okafor stood up when he came in. He wasn't sure why it was not something he had anticipated, but she stood, and then the others did. And he walked to the open seat and sat down without saying anything about it, because there was nothing to say. Victoria went to the head of the table. "Let's begin," she said. He opened the documentation. He uncapped one of the pens he had brought from his office, the same way he had laid out his clothes the night before, and confirmed the route and set his alarm for 5:15, with attention. Without ceremony, on the notepad, beside the note he had already made about the cascade inconsistency, he wrote a second line. He would bring it up when the appropriate point in the agenda arrived, not before, not to display it, but because it was relevant and because that was what he was here to do. At the window at the end of the room, a pale square of February light sat undisturbed. Somewhere across the city, in a classroom at Westbrook Elementary, Lily was reading a book about a girl who lived in a lighthouse. Douglas was in her backpack. Her inhaler was in the front pocket, where it always was. The weather was cold but clear, and the appointment with Dr. Claudine Roth at Mercy General was confirmed for the following Tuesday, an appointment that had been scheduled by Caldwell Group's benefits coordinator on Friday afternoon, through the network coverage that was now, as of this morning, in effect. Her father was at work. He was exactly on time. The value a man carries is not announced in the moments when the world is watching. It lives in the choices made when no one will know, in the car pulled to the shoulder, in the silence held rather than broken, in the second mug set on the counter each morning for a daughter who needs it. It does not ask to be seen. It only asks to be recognized, eventually, by those who know how to look.